There's a lot for me to talk about with Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. The visual design, sound design, setting, lore, mechanics, its own context within the FromSoftware back catalogue. Any of these could form the basis of a full-length video. Today, however, we are picking up at a point that hasn't escaped the notice of players, critics, developers and journalists in the 3 or so weeks since the game was released. Is Sekiro Shadows Die Twice too hard? We could go down the rabbit hole on this one and get our dictionaries out and post screen caps of definitions, but I really don't think that would be helpful for us here, because the question isn't whether Sekiro is hard. All of From's games are hard. It is something that players expect to even actively seek out. The question is whether it is too hard, which comes with a completely new set of implications and questions all of their own. This video aims to break down this question, because when you pull on this thread, a whole heap of stuff unravels along with it. We'll begin with an explanation of my own experiences with FromSoftware's games, as I believe that discussion of any game's relative difficulty cannot ignore the player's own experiences with similar games, or even games from the same series. Secondly, we'll discuss the game's mechanics and level design and their own impacts on the relentless nature of Sekiro's gameplay. We'll conclude with talking about the modifier 2 and what it implies for the way in which people engage with video games themselves. Let's get started. I have to acknowledge that any opinion that I have on this subject is inevitably informed by the fact that I've already played most of the games made by FromSoftware and completed them all fairly recently, within the last 4 months or so, thanks to Steam's Christmas sale. I've cried bitter, frustrated tears facing up against Ornstein and Smough. I've ground the Hardy Knights into dust beneath my boots. I've breezed the Yorm the Giant fight because I googled it and discovered that he conveniently keeps the only weapon that can do any damage to him beside his throne. As a result, my opinion is instantly biased, if you like, because I've already broken through the wall that the games FromSoftware makes throw up for their players. Now, I don't want to be disingenuous here. My first encounter with the studio was through the Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition on the PC, you know, the one where you have to download a third-party program to make the game even halfway playable. I hit the wall around Sen's Fortress and the game chewed me up and spat me out. I just wasn't having fun. The game itself is pretty bleak and oppressing, but Sen's Fortress itself I found was particularly so, and the bullshit rolling ball mechanism that resets itself randomly every time that you die, well, that didn't help either. Years passed. I started to watch Joseph Anderson's and H-Bomber Guy's Dark Souls videos and I felt the pull again. Just before Christmas last year I bought Dark Souls Remastered and dived back in. Bell Gargoyles, Capra Demon, Quailag, Sen's Fortress loomed and something clicked. After hours smashing my head against the wall, it was as though the wall had evaporated and I found myself falling into a deep, dark, swirling pool. I was sucked in. I beat Dark Souls. I beat Dark Souls 2, the Scholar of the First Edition. I beat Dark Souls 3 at the end of January this year, and I was left thirsting for more. I did not, however, beat these games alone. I had help in the form of wikis, tips from friends, YouTube videos, and plain old looking up boss strategy guides. I knew that I had to destroy Seath's Crystal before I would be able to damage the dragon himself before I even approached his boss gate door. I knew that I needed the Transient Curse before I could kill the ghosts in the Anor Londo ruins. My wikiing reached its peak in Dark Souls 2, where it would not be unfair to say that I practically played the game with the guide open beside me. Nevertheless, it was still me swinging my avatar's sword, it was still me with my heart in my mouth as I frantically dodged and rolled to avoid Lothric and his goddamn teleporting attacks. This is beyond the scope of this video, but I learned how to play these games by trial and error, spending literally hours finding my own preferred playstyle and honing my skills. FromSoftware is an incredibly light touch when it comes to tutorialising their games, perhaps even to the point that the way that they design their games is maddeningly obtuse. Their games, complete with the worlds, lore, mechanics and items, are placed in front of the player, and from then on it is really up to the player themselves to teach themselves how the games are played. When I respond to a question asking whether Sekiro is too hard, then I necessarily come from a position where I already know how to play these games, both in terms of the technical requirements of actually engaging with them, but also in terms of the mindset with which you need to approach FromSoftware's games. This second point here is perhaps the most important one, because while you can literally learn how to play these games, it is not necessarily so easy to teach yourself the patience required to beat them. I hate to keep referring to these two, but for me it really is the truth. I knew how to beat Ornstein and Smough long before I actually beat them. It was only persistence and a pig-headed refusal to give up that actually put the Lord Vessel in my hands. I brute forced my way through the Dark Souls games using an axe and my dodging and rolling abilities. I largely eschewed armour, relying on the fleetness of my movement to evade attacks. I two-handed the axe throughout all 3 games, smashing my opponents to dust at my feet. No pyromancy spells entered my inventory. I sold every bow and arrow that I discovered in the world. I came at enemies, dodged their attacks, and then came at them again until they were dead. This strategy will get you killed very quickly and very splashily in Sekiro. Where the Dark Souls games are about stepping toward enemies, Sekiro is about holding your ground, deflecting their attacks, breaking their guard, and seizing the advantage when your enemy is down. I spent the first 15 hours with the game trying to unlearn the lessons of the Dark Souls games, and likely will spend the next 15 hours doing the same. The mechanic that has changed the game between Souls and Sekiro is the introduction of posture. Each enemy has a posture meter that gradually builds up during combat. Dealing damage increases this meter, as does blocking the enemy's attack. It is a legitimate and advisable strategy to simply block each enemy's attacks until their posture meter is full. Emphasis is less on waiting for a moment to attack and more on reading your opponent's attacks, getting the timings down perfectly and being able to block each one in order to break down his posture completely. When this happens, you can execute a death blow, a cool animation that finishes off an enemy. With bosses, expect to have to fill their posture meter twice and deliver the death blow twice. Posture completely changes how Sekiro plays compared to its predecessors. It is a game that is about defense as opposed to attack, and that is why I spent so much time at the beginning of this video explaining my own experience with FromSoftware's games. Because while my knowledge of what From expects of its players helped me in terms of how I mentally approach Sekiro, that same knowledge in a way put me at a disadvantage because every time I load the game I still, in the first few minutes at least, approach combat as if it is a Souls game. So when discussing any suggestion that Sekiro is too hard, it must be acknowledged that experience of previous From games does not necessarily mean that you have an advantage over someone who doesn't. It can, in fact, be a disadvantage. At the risk of being reductive then, you beat Sekiro by memorising enemies' attack patterns, learning their tells, deflecting their attacks, and then attacking when you see an opening. You just gotta get good at the game, am I right guys? Well, it definitely helps to be able to play the game well, but difficulty, however, can be modified in other ways than how much damage you can deliver and how much enemies can take. Let's take perhaps the most defining symbol of FromSoftware's games, the bonfires in the case of the Souls games, reimagined as the sculptor's idols in the Sekiro games. These are landmarks in the world in which you can perform a variety of actions, including upgrading your character, warping to another such landmark elsewhere in the world, receive fresh health charges, and so on, depending on which game you are playing. What makes them so, and I hate this word, iconic, is that these are the places that the player character returns to when they are killed in battle, and this is what makes them relevant in terms of a discussion of the relative difficulty of Sekiro and the From games as a whole. How close or how far apart these landmarks are spread has as much of an impact on the perceived difficulty, I think, as any other mechanic does in From's games. Placing them too close together means that the penalty for death is reduced because the player only loses, say, 2 minutes of progress by being sent back to the last landmark they rested at. Placing them too far away increases the penalty of death because the player loses, say, 10 minutes of progress. Adjusting the distance between these checkpoints, if you like, introduces or removes a strategic consideration that a player has to make in terms of continuing on when they are low on health in the hope of a checkpoint being around the next corner, or turning back, refilling their health charges and starting again. Managing the distance between these landmarks then very much has an impact on the perceived difficulty of any given section of these games. For new players, the route between Firelink Shrine and Undead Berg bonfires in Dark Souls 1 is arguably one of the toughest parts of the game. It is the first area after the tutorial section of the Undead Asylum and the point at which the training wheels have been taken off. The player is on their own and also has to deal with multiple enemies for the first time. There is an element of verticality here, a guy throwing firebombs, maybe even a jump over to the path under the bridge, which is frustrating enough given the backwards controls that game has. Going up the steps and into the tunnel, there is a rat lurking behind the player which can poison them if they don't notice it, and at this point in the game they probably don't have the right item to cure it. Up another set of steps and onto the walls of the berg itself, there are 4 or 5 guys here, including another firebomb guy, each with different attacks. Through a fog door and up yet another flight of steps are 6 more enemies, 2 of which have shields before, thanks sweet buttered crumpets, a bonfire. 16 or 17 enemies stand between the Firelink Shrine bonfire and the Undead Berg bonfire, which is a lot for a new player getting to grips with new mechanics and what can seem at first to be an almost arbitrarily punishing combat system. Placing a bonfire, say, at the end of the tunnel with a rat would effectively cut this route in half, but also make it half as challenging. Adjusting the distance between bonfires and bosses has a similar effect. It doesn't make the bosses themselves mechanically any more difficult, but places more pressure on the player when they do reach that fog gate, as death means having to fight, or more accurately run past, enemies all over again to return to the boss. I'm going to use the example of Dark Souls and that Capra demon here because after Ornstein and Smaug, Capra is my least favourite and most dreaded boss for reasons that this video doesn't need to go into. To get to Capra, you start from Firelink Shrine, going up as if to get to Undead Burg. Instead of going left and up toward the bonfire, you carry on down the tunnel through a gate that you opened earlier after fighting through the lower Undead Burg. You go down a long winding staircase, kill 2 of the assassin enemies with their bullshit backstab attacks up the flight of steps, killing the 2 attack dogs lurking at the top, and then through the fog gate, whereupon Capra smashes your head in because his boss arena is about as wide as you are tall, and his first attack comes at you about half a second after you take control of your character after the animation of entering the arena. You are returned to Firelink and have to make the journey again. Along the tunnel, which seems to lengthen every time you pass through it, down the windy staircase, kill the undead assassins, up the stairs, kill the undead dogs, and then back to Capra again, where his attack dogs stunlock you and he smashes you into the ground again. Firelink, tunnel, stairs, assassins, stairs, dogs, Capra. The Capra fight is made more difficult and certainly more frustrating by how far the most convenient bonfire is from his fog gate. Placing a bonfire right outside his door would mean that your almost inevitable death is less punishing. The penalty of death would be reduced, and so would the relative difficulty of this part of the game. How does Sekiro's difficulty rank up in this context then? I can quite easily name a number of bosses that have sculptors' idols very close to them, such as the Chained Ogre, General Yamauchi, the Lone Shadow Swordsman, and General Matsumoto. There are even some where the boss is the first enemy the player encounters after they rest there. Lady Butterfly, General Karawada, Ashina Elite Jinsuke Sase, and Genichiro Ashina being examples of these. These bosses are mechanically tough. It took me about an hour to learn the Chained Ogre's attacks and devise strategies to beat him, but even then there was a hefty slice of luck. The price of failure, at least in the context of game time between sculptors' idols and bosses, is actually fairly forgiving. Rematches are more often than not instant, or so close to instant that it isn't worth noting. If I'm trying to find an example of frustrating placement of the sculptor's idols in terms of the frustration similar to that of the Capra fight in Dark Souls 1, I struggle. There is a fair old gauntlet between the Blazing Bull and his closest idol, but there is a shortcut which I think is fairly easy to find if you are in any way interested in exploring Sekiro's world. It is a similar situation with the 7 Ashina Spears fight. There is quite a sizable number of enemies between you and him, but almost all of them can be bypassed with a grappling hook and some stealth. Juzo the Drunkard has 2 sets of enemies between you and him, but the first set can be snuck past, maybe a third of the second set can be stealthed to death, and you have an ally whom you can call upon when you finally face Juzo man to man. When considering the distance between the sculptor's idols themselves, again I would say that From's design is pretty spot on. In the early game, idols are relatively close together, which supports players as they learn the new mechanics and move from area to area. The distance between them gradually increases as you go through the game. The space between the Senpu Temple and the Shigendo idols is particularly vast, with new types of enemies with their own new mechanics standing in your way. There is plenty of invisigrass and numerous grapple points up in the trees for you to utilise though, and stealthing your way past these enemies is a very easy way of getting through this area with little difficulty at all. The worst example I can think of is the route from the Bamboo Thicket Slope idol to the Hirato Estate main hall idol, a gauntlet of 16 or 17 enemies and a considerable distance purely in terms of travelling. The enemies themselves though are ones that the players already encountered, so the only real difficulty here is in managing the space and making sure that you aren't swarmed. Beyond the placement of the idols themselves, the level design itself contributes to negating some of the frustration inherent in the difficulty of these games. The Ashina Castle idol is the base for the fight against General Matsumoto. The player kills him and his 4 guards and then probably heads right into the alley that runs parallel to the staircase with Matsumoto at the head of it. Fujioka, the info broker, asks you to kill all the enemies in the immediate area in exchange for information. You do so, killing maybe 12 enemies in total, including a new enemy, the Nightjar Ninja. You fight your way onto the roof of the castle, facing off against maybe 7 or 8 Nightjar Ninja, tough enemies on their own, even tougher when fought as part of a group. You dash across the rooftops, which can seem somewhat maze-like because of how similar they look to each other, and more than likely blunder around a corner where a grapple point winks at you, and sweet raspberry jam, there's an idol. There are perhaps 20 enemies between the Ashina Castle idol and the Upper Tower Antechamber idol, a hefty gauntlet for even experienced players. One too many mistakes and it's back to the base of the castle and you have to fight through all those enemies again. Except you don't. After having fought your way through the gauntlet the first time, you might notice a grapple point above you and to your right as you head back up the staircase to where Matsumoto was. From this point you can leap straight onto the castle rooftops, leaving the alleyway of enemies behind you. The option was always there, you probably just didn't notice it because your gaze was caught by the big, obvious boss-looking enemy at the top of the staircase. The verticality of the level design means that you can skip past enemies that you've already fought before in order to carry on with your progression, or you can fight them again if you wish. The choice is yours and is a much more organic design choice than forcing you to run past enemies like you might do to get back to Capra in Dark Souls 1, or forcing you to grind enemies until they no longer spawn as in Dark Souls 2. This choice is present throughout Sekiro, manifesting itself in the division of gameplay into combat and stealth. In the example of the gauntlet between the Senpu Temple and the Shugendo idols, the level design practically hits the player over the head when it is advertising the stealth opportunities to the player. I would even go so far as to argue that you're not meant to move through this area in straight combat with the motley array of monks in front of you, at least not the first time, and perhaps not even in this direction. I would say that the level design is telling you to stealth your way through this area in one direction and then slash your way through it in the other. Sekiro ultimately is a stealth game, and every single thing about the entire game's level design is pushing you towards stealthing your way around situations instead of smashing your way through them. While acknowledging that Sekiro is a marked step away from the Souls combat-focused gameplay, it must at the same time be acknowledged that the Souls formula is very much baked into its DNA. In the context of a discussion of Sekiro's difficulty specifically, Sekiro carries on the tradition of penalising the player for death. We've already seen how players are penalised for death in terms of having to repeat sections of the game in order to return to the point at which they died, but these games penalise players in other ways too, perhaps most notably in the form of stripping the player of the in-game currency that is earned by killing enemies. In the Souls games, the player earns souls from killing enemies. In Sekiro, the player earns sen and experience points. In the Souls games, souls are spent on levelling up and buying in-game weapons and armour. Upon death, any souls that the player has in their possession are lost irreversibly upon death. In Sekiro, sen is solely used for buying items, and experience points are spent purchasing character upgrades, the equivalent of levelling up in the Souls games. The difference between the two is that the player loses half of their sen and experience points every time they die. So if Wolf has 1000 experience points and 1000 sen in his possession when he dies, this number is reduced to 500 in each when he resurrects. The next time he dies, this number, assuming no more experience or sen has been earned, is reduced to 250, and the next 125. In Sekiro, the penalty for dying the first time is the highest, with each subsequent death being penalised in exactly the same way, yet at the same time being less of a loss than the previous time. The Souls games are arguably harsher, less forgiving in this regard than Sekiro. Couple this with the fact that you can trade sen that you have earned for sen pouches with merchants, which are mechanically identical to the souls that can be discovered by exploring the worlds of the Souls series, and you would be forgiven for thinking that Sekiro is actually more forgiving, not less, than any of its predecessors. There is a more nuanced consequence to death in Sekiro, however. I'm not going to go into the story reasons or the broader lore of Sekiro here because that discussion deserves its own video. For our purposes, we just need to know that when the wolf dies, he takes something from the world in order to be resurrected, either during battle or at a sculptor's idol. Die too many times and a character in the world becomes sick with a disease called dragon rot. Keep dying and the disease spreads to other characters in the world. The chance of resurrecting without any of your sen or experience points being deducted, a mechanic called Unseen Aid, reduces the more you die as well. As the world gets sicker, less opportunities become open to the player. Merchants might get sick and not be able to sell unique items, for instance. What we've just seen are examples of mechanics that don't have an effect on how difficult the game is per se, but are consequences that change how the player engages with the world. For myself, I won't face a new boss if I haven't spent all my skill points or bought as many sen pouches as I can. Death changes Sekiro's world and has implications for the people in it. For some players this will have more of an effect on their playstyle than others, but regardless indirectly makes the game more or less challenging. Before we move on to the last part of the video, it is worth at this point talking about some of the flaws in Sekiro's design that can be exploited to the player's advantage. The resurrection mechanic, for instance. At the beginning of the game, the player has nodes of resurrective power that they can spend to resurrect on the battlefield without being taken back to the last sculptor's idol. This means that players effectively can have a second attempt immediately against enemies that have just cut them down. The game is, however, inconsistent with how different enemies react after the player spends one of their resurrective nodes to return to life. Non-boss enemies, if Wolf is out of their line of sight, will return to their normal state as if they had never seen the player in the first place. Boss enemies, however, regardless of whether they can see Wolf, return to their active state and the battle continues. The inconsistency is jarring purely in terms of the laws of the world that Sekiro is trying to craft, but I understand mechanically speaking the boss encounters wouldn't be nearly as challenging if you could fake your death, wait until their backs were turned and then sneak up on them for a stealth kill. You can, however, game the non-boss enemies in exactly this way, and it is more of a viable choice open to the player to simply let a tough enemy cut them down, knowing that they can simply resurrect and stealth kill them when their back is turned. While we were nitpicking, the AI can be slightly too sluggish when the player is slitting the throats of their comrades standing right next to them, and it can be too easy to just run away when you are being swarmed, wait for the enemies to forget you had ever existed, and then start again on your blood-soaked crusade. 2. The modifier is interesting in the context of this question because it implies that there is a certain level of difficulty beyond which it is unreasonable to expect players to proceed in order to enjoy whatever piece of media they have in front of them. When it comes to video games in particular, the question of how difficult they are to engage with has further implications than, say, the same question applied to books or film. Ulysses is a notoriously difficult book. It is 1,000 pages of largely nonsense with a cast of characters that talk all over each other and written in such a way that is deliberately opaque. It is nevertheless written in English, and anyone who can read English can physically read Ulysses. The difficulty is not in finishing the book, it is in actually being able to engage or even perceive any of the themes with which it is dealing. Funny Games is a difficult film to watch because of the way it places the images in front of a viewer and the frankly repulsive attitudes of its antagonists. It is not, however, difficult to sit through exactly, you just need to hit play and 2 hours later you are done, whereupon you can throw the disc in the bin and never have to think about it again. With games, however, difficulty takes on a different dimension because of the mechanical implications. There are some games, undoubtedly Sekiro included, that people do not finish because they just don't have the patience to develop the skill to beat it, or are unwilling to accept the design philosophy of the From games in general. Designers have to make games beatable because, and this is a point that again this video doesn't have the space to discuss further, but which nevertheless needs to be made, the enjoyment of a video game is predicated on the ability of a player to beat it. If a developer were to make the game so difficult as to be nigh on unbeatable, they would very quickly be facing a backlash from a player base whose attitude had shifted from enjoying the challenge to hating the arbitrariness of the set of systems and rules with which they were engaging. But Sekiro is beatable. I've seen it done. Players have done speedruns, even no-hit speedruns, and the game hasn't been out a month yet. These runs are invariably authored by From mega fans, people who have been with the series from the ground floor and who have poured hours and hours of their lives into these games. They are an elite level of player, far above my own modest skill and experience level, which is perhaps ultimately how we can approach the use of the 2 modifier that we've been dancing around for the last 20 minutes. 2 implies that Sekiro is operating on a difficulty level far above that at which most normal players are operating, far above which the majority of players are willing to reach. It implies an elitism on the behalf of From, an idea that the studio set out on first principles to make a game that would be too hard for most players to beat. It implies that From were being arbitrarily, deliberately, obtusely perverse in the way that they built difficulty into their game. And I think that we see in this video that this is just not true. In fact, in some ways, Sekiro is more forgiving and fairer on the player than in any of the preceding games by From. We've seen how difficulty is affected by things other than the number of enemies, how big their health bars are, and how much damage they deal. Ultimately, I think it is the change in emphasis and, in my opinion, the sharpening and refining of the combat mechanics that has reframed From's games and thus reframed how people critically engage with them. In any event, the more people talk about this game, the more they engage with the design philosophy and mechanics and how they impact the way players interact with their digital worlds, I think is for the better. Thanks for watching. Hi guys, thanks for getting to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please click that like button. Subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. I'm going to do more videos of this type on specific topics, I suppose, as opposed to on games themselves. And if you've got any questions or if you've got anything that you want to ask me, put it in the comments at the end of the video. This is a little kind of post-credits bit, because I thought it was it wasn't funny at the time, but it's an interesting thing that happened to me in the context of a discussion about how difficult Sekiro is. And I'm going to put, because I did manage to capture it on a stream, so I am going to put the footage of that event at the end of this video for you to enjoy now. So once again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to making lots more videos of this type in the future. Otherwise, take care, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Right. Carry on. Save data is corrupt. Are you serious? So, what does that mean? What does that mean, game? Is that all of my... Is that all of my progress gone? Oh my god. Oh my god. So the game, my computer crashed, and I think the game file is dead. My save, at least.